So welcome everyone to one of our podcast segments for Black Maternal Health Week. Today we will be discussing the intersection between reproductive justice and environmental justice. Today we do have two team members from the environmental justice team at Black Women for Wellness. We have Kayla and Tiana and myself, Chanel, who will be discussing the intersection between the two, sharing some stories, highlights that we see in the news regarding environmental justice and reproductive justice. So before we start with our hot topics and just sharing stories, we do want to define what reproductive justice is and what environmental justice is. A lot of people may not know and may not even know that there is an intersection between the two. So before we get started, we will like to define what these two topics are. So reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children or to not have children, and to parent the children that you have in a safe and sustainable community. In addition, it does acknowledge how Black and Indigenous women's socioeconomic status, gender, political power, and race influences their reproductive care experiences. And just giving some background on how reproductive justice started, Indigenous women and women of color, Indigenous people have always fought for reproductive justice, but the term was invented in 1994, right before attending the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, where the entire world agreed that the individual right to plan your own family must be central to global development. And so a group of Black women gathered in Chicago in June of 1994, coined the term. So these women named themselves Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice, and that is how RJ, or reproductive justice, is born. It was rooted in the internationally accepted human rights framework created by the United Nations, and it combines reproductive rights and social justice. So they launched the movement by publishing a historic full-page statement. They received 800 signatures, and just 3 years later, an organization called Sister Song started this multi-ethnic RJ movement. And so that is what reproductive justice is. Is believed to be a human right. So it is a comprehensive body of law that details the right of individuals and the responsibilities of the government to protect these rights. So we want women to be able to have these choices. And so that is why we do the work that we do. Next, I would like for Kayla and Tiana to share what is environmental justice, and then we can talk about how they are intersected.
Hey, so this is Kayla Thomas, EJ coordinator with Black Women for Wellness. My definition of environmental justice is essentially reducing the targeted harm that is present on vulnerable communities, specifically Black communities, from land use policies, water access, and air quality policies that affect communities of color. From the beginning of time, there have been a number of policies that target Black communities in the sense of where we are zoned and placed and where we are living is oftentimes a target area for chemical dumping, the sites for industrial plants. And because of that, we experience a disproportionate exposure to harmful chemicals that have an effect on our health, and more specifically reproductive health. And when you think about that, and we talk about the tenets of reproductive justice, one of the main bases is being able to raise your family in a healthy and sustainable environment. We can't have that without environmental justice. So I'll pass it on to Tiana to introduce herself as well.
Hello, my name is Tiana, and I also work as an environmental justice program coordinator here at Black Women for Wellness. And I think Kayla touched on all the important parts, but we also work a lot in personal product care. So she mentioned that a lot of the problems with environmental and under the environmental justice umbrella is that Black individuals and brown individuals are overexposed to a lot of toxic chemicals and just horrible things in our environment. And one of the large sources of exposure is through our personal products. So the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, is supposed to better regulate the things that we put in our bodies and we put in our mouths. But unfortunately, they only regulate about 11 of the over 10,000 chemicals that people interact with regularly through cleaning and hair and just general hygiene. And a lot of research has shown that even that injustice, which is broad, it gets a lot more granular when we look at Black women. And we've worked on a study that has found that Black women are even more so targeted and more so exposed to toxic chemicals and personal care products. So we also work to try to mitigate that both through education and through behavior change, but then also through policy and advocacy.
Yes, thank you guys for sharing, those definitions and how it relates. I think you guys already have touched on it, but we can start with discussing the intersection between the two. And so, as we said in our definitions regarding environmental justice and reproductive justice, I think they both incorporate, a social justice framework for advocating for social change. So both, seeks to reduce, environmental burdens borne by people of color, women, and, Brown and Black people living in marginalized, economically disadvantaged communities. And so, as I know, reproductive justice, demands that, the decision of whether or not, women want to have a child, for family planning and rights to raise a child, that it should not, that should not be impeded by distribution of environmental burdens. And so we see that individuals in marginalized societies, are sometimes forced to make decisions based on the fact that the communities that they live on. So could you guys possibly touch on like some environmental hazards that we are seeing in our communities of color?
Sure. I think the biggest one, and we work on this in our partnership with STAND, is a lot of our communities in South Los Angeles are placed next to oil drilling sites. And these oil drilling sites produce an offset of chemicals that have an effect on your respiratory system to your reproductive health. And recent studies have shown that living in proximity to these sites have allow women to have a more likely to experience preterm birth than those that don't live in proximity to these sites. And preterm birth, unfortunately, is the #1 cause of infant mortality. Outside of that, when we look at water, a lot of these water systems are not as regulated as they should be. And many of them placed in these areas in South Los Angeles operate over the maximum contaminant level for that water utility. So essentially that just means that the water being produced that's coming out of your tap has chemicals in it, and the appropriate systems acknowledge that, but there's not any action being done to kind of mitigate that issue. So when we look at those two things, I think that kind of addresses the traditional idea when we talk about built environment. But then when we shift over into the product side, which I'll let Tiana speak on more, we have this compound issue of the area that I am set to live in my community. The traditional idea of environment is not healthy or safe or designed for me to live a sustainable and healthy lifestyle. And then I'm also being targeted for the products that I am then allowed to buy. I'm being pushed oftentimes through marketing strategies to buy products that also aren't good for me and my body and my health as a Black woman. So I think it creates a compound issue, and I'll let Tiana touch on the product side a little bit more, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's so well put, because I think the other big part of it along both, pillars, whether it's the personal care products or the built environment, one is that they definitely intersect, as you said, and that, but it's also that it's the physical effects. And then I think it's also the mental health effects. I mean, for a mom to have a child, and I am not a mom, so I'm not speaking from personal experience, but for a mom to have a child and then to not be able to bring that child home to a place where they know there's clean water, where the temperature isn't ridiculously hot, where they can feel comfortable taking their child for walks without worrying about air quality on a given day. There's just there's just an extra level of burden, both that people experience physically and that people experience in the way that people have to change and adapt in order to raise kids, which, as you said, is a big component of reproductive justice. And that's true, the physical and the mental health effects, both on both side and the product side. And on the product side, I think we all want to live in a world where when we go grocery shopping or when we go shopping for our personal care products, we can just pick anything off the shelf that looks like it'll be good for us, for our hair, for kids, for sisters, brothers, whoever it might be, and to trust that that product is going to do what it says it's going to do, whether it's moisturize our hair or clean our floors or whatever it is. We should be able to trust that it's not going to also harm us, that it's not going to also harm us overall, and then it's also not going to harm our reproductive abilities. And one huge example where this has not been true is with Johnson & Johnson. So there's been so much evidence and so much research put into the reality that Johnson & Johnson has been selling a baby powder product for decades, recently discontinued in the US and Canada, but not worldwide, that has been contaminated with asbestos. And where they knew it was contaminated with asbestos, there's records that show that they knew about this since the 70s. And every important, or most of the important federal agencies that regulate and that pay attention to asbestos have said that it's carcinogenic, so it can cause cancer. And right now there's lawsuits with over 38,000 women who now unfortunately have ovarian cancer and have linked that to use of baby powder. So, and baby powder is made out of talc, and the issue is that talc, when it's sourced, unfortunately, can also have traces of asbestos in it. And even more research has shown that even it's very difficult, if not impossible, to actually even create talcum powder or source talcum powder that does not have asbestos in it. So that's just one example where it's literally called baby powder. It's something that people were targeted and told that they're supposed to put on their kids or put on themselves, and that was supposed to make them feel fresh and natural, but in reality could cause cancer. And different studies and individuals have shown that it has caused cancer. So that's just one glaring example of how unfortunate but real it is that Black women and women in general are so overexposed and so underprotected, both in the places where we live and where we hope our kids will grow up or hope our kids won't have to grow up in, but then also in the products that we have to use on a regular basis.
And I think the interesting thing is,
go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead. I was just gonna speak about the baby powder, but I want you to finish first, Kayla.
I was gonna go into just more generally about products, because I think us as Black women, I think we want to make more conscious choices. And I think that we've pushed a lot of this movement into wanting to buy more green products, which marketing companies have picked up on. And so it's led to this problem of greenwashing, where a lot of times it's like the product is the same harmful product, but now it just has a green label with some flowers on it. It's supposed to now be better for us, but it's not. So I think it becomes, again, it's such a compound issue, because how do we create solutions when we want to do better? And it's obvious because of how the marketing has shifted. But again, there's no accountability on that industry side to actually look out for the consumers that they target. And it's always us at the other side of that target.
And yes, my point is going to be for the women that want to do better. What happens if that isn't at their local, pharmacy or beauty supply store, right? Or what happens if they can't afford different products? Or what about the women that, may not even know yet? I know it's really big right now, this with baby powder and Johnson & Johnson, but other products may not even know, the harmful chemicals or toxins that is in it, and still using it, because what if that is all they can afford, or they just, don't have the research to know? So I think it just shows how unfortunate it is for this community of women that, they may want to do better, they may not even know that, they should be doing better, and how do we get those resources to them, or how do we help them? Because, sometimes it's all that they can afford, all that they can do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're touching on such an important issue related to the fact that there are so many systems of oppression that harm us on a regular basis. And classism and ableism and white supremacy and all of these different things. And so many of them you can see in the beauty industry and in how Black women have to interact in the beauty industry. So one example is, even though the recent good news about the Crown Act getting passed, But there's still plenty of examples of women historically and even presently who feel, because of the way our society works, that we have to change ourselves, change our hair the way that it grows out of our head, in order to get a job that might provide us with the financial ability to be able to move our family or move ourselves to a safer environment, to a safer community. And then in doing that, you might have to use products that aren't good for our health. Or we might be, and then if the decision is made to not do that, then there might be some unfortunate repercussions for that in terms of not getting jobs or being discriminated upon. So there's just so many different layers upon layers of ways in which environmental injustices, reproductive injustices all affect Black women throughout our lives, and then even so much as like throughout a single day and throughout a single, interaction.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that too, outside of not having access to quote unquote better products that are healthier for your body, I think as Black women, we're targeted to think that we need 1,000,002 products to be able to walk out the door each day, which is just so far from the case. But it goes back to just the structural racism that's in place to beauty standard that inform beauty standards. So I remember when I was like, I don't know, like going into 3rd or 4th grade and but finally like having BO and things, just as a Black woman feeling like I smelt worse than other people, and like feeling like I needed to do a lot because I was Black. I just that more of a pressure on yourself.
Right.
So, and again, I know a lot of people, it's you go to the store, and again, I had to get myself out of this framework too of like, okay, I need a deodorant, I need a body spray, I need a really good smelling body wash. What does my feminine care smell like? And now I'm leaving with all of these fragrance filled products to kind of fight this stigmatized idea as a Black woman, I may smell worse, and I can't smell worse, and because of society. And when the reality is, like, we have bodies, and if you take the natural upkeep of your body, you will smell just fine. And when you have natural products, you still will smell fine, and you're taking care of your body. But again, like these social standards that have been pushed on us since we were young, again, just perpetuates the issue of we just use more products than really what we need, and again, overexposing ourselves.
Yes, I think that's a great point, Kayla. I've never thought of it that way, but I remember being younger too, right? And you go into the store, or you're shopping, you're like, okay, yes, I do need deodorant, I do need body spray, just a list of things. And I don't remember back then even thinking of looking at, what was in my products that I was using, right? It wasn't even a thought. It was just like, okay, yeah, that's a brand that I know. And so it smells good, I'm going to use it, and not even realizing, the effects that it could have on my body. I think we were, like, it's a social framework, just being like, okay, it smells good, or this is a brand that I hear about, and I'm going to use it, rather than taking the time to research, or just, wanting to know more about what we're actually putting on our body.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's like I never stank, but again, it's that fear.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but that was like when my mom was first talking about BO and things of that nature, it was instilled that fear in me of like, you can never smell anything.
Yes, and it's like, it's our natural body, right? So it's like a natural smell that we have, but instead you're just like, no, I need to smell like flowers, right? Like, I think that's everyone said, like, it needs to smell lovely, flowers, and just smell good, when it's like, naturally our body has an odor that is just naturally supposed to smell like. And so, trying to move away from that is, it's difficult, because it's been ingrained in us for so long that, you don't even think like, whatever way I smell is okay, or whatever natural odor that I have is fine. You're just taught like flowers, and it has to smell good, or like pretty, or whatever, the way it was.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's just like, I think I lost my train of thought. I had a point and I lost it. I'll come back to it.
No worries. I
mean, I think you talk about the fear, and again, going back to, there's just so many different systems of structural racism, but there's the case in London of the child who was menstruating, and the child's teacher apparently said that they believed the child had cannabis on them, and so they called the police to do a strip search of this child, while the child was menstruating. And then the police who did the strip search refused to allow the child to change their pad and made that child put on the same pad and go back to class. And this child was made to feel unsafe both in their classroom, Black child, and was made to feel unsafe through the police officers that came and did that. And we talk about the teacher apparently said that they thought they smelled cannabis and that was the excuse for treating a child in that manner. So it goes back to what you said about like fearing how we smell and thinking that could be somehow aggressive for people, that and that it's ridiculous. It's just like there are no words to describe how ridiculous that is. So then maybe I would hate for that to happen, but maybe that child or another parent somewhere else might have read this story and rubbed their own child down with every flowery, smelly product they could find in hopes that their child wouldn't be harassed and discriminated against in the same way. And just thinking about how much of an extra burden we have and people have to even think about that in a place of education or just going about, your day-to-day life. It's just so horrible. It's so sad.
Yeah, when we think about just intimate care, it's already hard enough that there's this stigma around periods and such being nasty in a sense. So I can only imagine the psychological trauma that a child had to face in being strip searched in that way, and already further shamed of a bodily function that is just simply a bodily function. Reading that story was completely disheartening.
Yeah, and I think it's just crazy for that excuse to be that they smelled marijuana, right? That has a very distinct smell. So, I mean, to just automatically say that this little girl smelled that way, or they thought that she did, is disheartening in itself, and is, targeting her as a Black woman. And then, of course, not letting her feel comfortable. I feel like when you're young and experiencing your cycle, it's scary, and you already feel so different about your body. To where that, she didn't feel comfortable. She didn't have anyone, advocating for her, anyone supporting her in that sense, where you just feel helpless and alone because, they're stripping you from just your womanhood and just everything about, the ability to feel good, the ability to feel comfortable in that space. So it was a very unfortunate story that, this little girl did experience this at a school in London. I wanted to touch on, and you brought up earlier, Kayla, regarding preterm delivery with Black women and how that leads to infant mortality, right? And so I know right now we're seeing the effects of climate change. We all know about it, we're all hearing about it. We know how, climate change and pollution and how it is, starting to affect Black women. So I, read this article, and I think it was crazy to hear how, due to climate change, that they found for every 10 degrees Fahrenheit increase, and this was in California, temperature increase, like there was an average increase in preterm delivery of about 8.6%. And for Black women, that was about 14.9%. And so, we're seeing these effects of climate change. And as we say, there's so many factors that Black women have to deal with, just from where they're living in their community, being next to power plants or the toxins near them in their community, and then this climate change that we're trying to make a difference with, but the increase in temperature is now also affecting them from going to have, preterm delivery. And that's also not something that we want Black women to experience as well.
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it creates, I think studies like these highlight the dissonance between what we see in the media of pushing forward this Green New Deal and us moving into a much more sustainable space. It really leaves you to question, when we look at stories like these, where do Black women and Black families fit into that narrative? Because as we're quote unquote building this green new future, are we addressing these issues that are being presented in the study? And oftentimes no. So when we talk about greenscaping and incorporating solar panels and doing all of this technological advancement to mitigate climate change, conversations about how we support already vulnerable communities where the already disproportionate chemical exposures are being presented are never included in those conversations. And it does a disservice to everyone involved because we cannot move forward into a genuinely greener and more sustainable future or earth unless we address said areas. I think, again, like creating this barring and this line between what we choose to look at and who has access to a green future, we can never have a green sustainable future if we're leaving folks behind. It doesn't work that way. It's the same way that we have an issue of removing humans in general from nature. We operate and we coincide. We can't move forward with one without the other. And I think until we realize those things, we're gonna still see these stories pop up. And again, we will never be able to move forward without recognizing these issues.
Yeah, because I think another point to kind of build off of that is that the physical structure of our society and sort of just the cultural layout of our society was all built on racism. It's structural racism. So when we look at physical cities, we have this unequal balance of wealth, we have this unequal balance of home ownership, an equal balance of access to green space, an equal balance of access to clean air and clean water. So if that's the scape that we have now, and we have this end goal of a green, equitable future, we have to really think, if it's unbalanced now, then we have to be very, very careful, and we have to be very, very inclusive, and we have to be very, very intentional to focus on communities that have been so long burdened, our community that has been so long burdened, in order to reach that endpoint, in order to get to that equitable place. Because you can't have the foundation that we have now, which is so unequal, and then think that one size fits all climate policies are going to get us to some beautiful, wonderful, equitable place. That's just not a reality. And one example of that is that there's been more studies to show that communities that have been redlined are often communities that are many degrees hotter, kind of aligned with the article that you brought up, Chanel. So that just goes to show that these systems, these very horrible systems, have created very clear ramifications now, and we have to address these things head on in order to make our futures better.
Yeah, and it's important to know that it's all intentional.
Yeah,
and none of it's a mistake. And I think that's always important to think about when we talk about natural disasters or
yes, I was going to touch on that.
Those things aren't accidents, and they become disastrous because of poor planning. When we talk about redlining and we look at Hurricane Katrina as an example.
Literally what I was saying.
That's my favorite example to look at, because nothing about Hurricane Katrina was a mistake. Those folks that were impacted the worst were placed in that area due to a history of redlining. So that was was a majority Black community because of redlining in the past. And because of that, there was a lack of zoning laws on FEMA's end, that they just didn't update their regulations. They didn't update the prime need for insurance to be able to accommodate for flooding. Those things had not been updated in years. And when I say years, I mean decades. And again, those things are overlooked because government systems and policies have done what they were meant to do and place people in place where they can be overlooked. And again, it's just all intentional. And I think that's so important to note when we talk about things of climate change and we use these passive words such as natural disasters and heat rising. It's not happening for no reason. Mm-hmm. It's being perpetuated by systems that are meant to perpetuate them.
Yeah, and one of my kind of, I say favorite statistic, it's not my favorite statistic, but I like it because it clarifies things. I think in the environmental justice work, we talk a lot about income as being a very clear indicator of people who unfortunately live under environmentally unjust conditions. And that is true, income is related. But actually, studies have found that there is a higher correlation. It is more significant that the places that are the most environmentally unjust, the places that have the most hazards, it's due to racism, not as much due to income. So there's been studies that have shown that Black families that are middle income so oftentimes live in worse conditions in terms of air quality and other environmental hazards than white families that are lower than the $10,000 annual threshold. So this goes to show that income does matter, and poverty in America does have a distinct role in people living in unsafe conditions. But just to build off of what Kayla said, it's grounded in racism. A lot of it is grounded in racism.
And we can look at Baldwin Hills, which is supposed to be the Black Beverly Hills. So you look up and you see an oil, all you see is an oil drilling site. And like, what sense does that make? Again, like, this is supposed to be the prosperous area for Black communities and that people look to, and in your skyline is all oil rigs.
You know, it's actually funny, speaking of Baldwin Hills, this is a little off topic, but we're starting to see that communities like Baldwin Hills, where they're not fully Black anymore, right? So this is a whole other topic, but now they're no longer able to even afford to stay in that community anymore, right? When that community was, you know, meant for them. So they're now starting to get pushed out of the community because of, you know, pricing and everything has changed. And so, yes, it was, you know, destined for them and it was created for them, but now we're starting to see that they're not even there as much as they were anymore, which is, you know, crazy to see, especially myself being born in Los Angeles and knowing it as, you know, the Black Beverly Hills. We're starting to see that it's not too many of us there anymore now. And so now it'll be great to see what happens with that, right? Well, will it change? Will the community change? Will it be gentrified? Where, you know, will you see that oil rig there in a couple of years? What will change now that we're seeing that it's not so many of us there in that community?
Yeah, green gentrification is such a big problem. I mean, you have a community that maybe fights for a long time for green space, for trees, for more sidewalks, for all the things that make that community healthier. And all of those things also increase property values. And all of those things also make those communities more interesting for other people who are looking to buy a home. And then we take that community that maybe had less wealth or did have less wealth and then is unable to, unfortunately, handle things like a COVID-19 pandemic or a recession. And then all that wonderful work that communities had fought for, access to green space, these making their community safer, now the benefits get to go to someone else. So you do bring up that is a very, very relevant and important point.
And speaking of, I want to go back also to Kayla's point with Hurricane Katrina. With that, we even saw that, you know, women, due to the flood, we had an increase where, you know, there was in particular a preterm birth. Women weren't able to, you know, go to the clinics or have their babies in the local hospitals that they originally had planned to due to that. And so we only saw that where Black women was truly affected by this natural disaster, and we saw a low birth rate. Of course, like I said, preterm deliveries. And so, you know, this ties into reproductive justice, where we had, you know, inaccessibility for reproductive, you know, services. And we, you know, end up having like unplanned pregnancies. Women weren't able to have, you know, that go through with their birthing plan, and they reduce, you know, their reproductive freedom. And so I think what you said about, you know, it being very intentional that, you know, how these things take place, and, you know, when Black people and Black women being placed in these communities and how it is affecting them, and, you know, also affecting, you know, them having birth and their pregnancy as well.
Yeah, I think when we highlight and put the dots together and we're able to bring the stories of these women and put them on an appropriate platform, I think it calls out a lot of these systems, because I think environmentalism has always been framed as this white space that Black people really have no interest in touching. Like, anything green is just not meant for us. And again, when we reframe what we define as environmentalism to include these harms, and it's just not limited to conservation sites and green spaces, you realize that when you're given the platform and we are given the education and resources, we care about these issues, and we can put the appropriate policymakers on the spot to create change. I think is the highlight in all of this. I think we touched on a lot of things that burden us, but I think the silver lining is that we work with an organization that is able to put our stories on a platform that we have not been allowed to previously, which I think is great, because when you pull forward these stories that we pulled, that we've talked about today from the Washington Post, or we put spotlight to these research studies that highlight that living in proximity to oil drilling sites leads to a higher rate of preterm birth. You're kind of calling these people out, and there's really not much you can do other than own that, yes, these systems, we don't want to change them because they are the way they are, or to make change. And I think it facilitates change in a way that we haven't seen as much in the past, or ever in the past. And you can see that with in Los Angeles with the recent passing from Los Angeles City Council as oil drilling as a non-conforming land use. There was a lot of that work that we did with STAND is a great tribute to power building in communities and with Black women and women of color, and giving them a place in these, to give city public comment in these city council hearings, to say, hey, this is my reality and this is how I'm being affected, and we need to push this issue up on the list because I'm here and I this is my life and my reality, and we need to have change. So I think that's the silver lining. There's so much more work that needs to be done. Even with this win that we had previously, there's so many more steps, but I think the more power we give to us as a community in invalidating invalidating these experiences is the main step towards change, and we see it.
Yes, I think there's power with what you said about women sharing their stories, right? We need to hear more of that, especially for a space that was considered to be white. We need to include more stories and more research with including Black women. And I think we touched on a lot today with, environmental justice and how it is affecting the community. What would be one thing that you would want, listeners to take away from, in the section of environmental justice and reproductive, such as environmental justice as a whole? What is one thing you would want them to take away or incorporate in their day-to-day, something that, will help make a difference?
I think for me, at least, is I've only had the honor to be at the company for about almost 2 months now. So I'm a newer face here. But I think for me, the big takeaway I want people to have is that we're here. Like, Black Women for Wellness is here. We are here to serve Black women and girls. And we are here as a listening ear. We are here to fight. We are here to empower. We are here. And we want everyone who is looking for an organization like ours to know that we're here and to reach out if they need anything.
I think the biggest takeaway I would like for someone to have from this is that as a Black woman, your experience is more than valid. It deserves to be heard. And any of these things that we touched on today in the scope of environmental injustice, we didn't create these burdens. And so I think that's a big thing too, is don't let any commercial or anything talking about green footprint tell you differently, is that we as a community did not create these injustices and problems. But we do have the power and resiliency to make change.
Yes, and I think highlighting what BWW does is really important. Education is key, right? So educating the community, keeping everyone informed, awareness, and also understanding the historical context. Like you said, Kayla, we did not create these, so understanding the history behind it, I think it's all great to keep us moving, forward and keep pushing through these disparities and these burdens that our community is facing. With that being said, we do have a list of events that is occurring for Black Maternal Health Week, and those are posted on our website. Also, I do want Kayla and Tiana to let you guys know that Earth Week is approaching. I want to make sure that you guys say the correct date for that as well, just so that the audience knows as well.
Yeah, so Earth Week will be from the 18th to the 24th, and we'll have a number of events throughout that whole week. You can find them on Instagram. I think we're also going to try to get them on Facebook, and then as well as the newsletter and on the website.
Perfect.
Yeah, just to, I guess, spotlight a couple of them. We have one event that's going to get deeper into the advocacy that Black Women in Wellness has done around Johnson & Johnson and the asbestos contaminated talc that very much so connects to the work being done during this week as well, during Black Mamas Matter Week.
Yes, thank you guys for your time. Thank you for just coming here discussing environmental justice with me. I think a lot of people don't even realize that there is an intersection between the two. So we appreciate your time and looking forward to working more with you guys and collaborating more with reproductive justice and environmental justice.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.